right, to kick off this next general session, we're joined again by someone many of you met in yesterday's breakout session, but this time the whole room will get to hear from her. Marta Turba is the Vice President of Content Strategy at WorldatWork, and she spent more than 25 years helping organizations design smarter, more effective total reward strategies across sectors like finance, healthcare, and tech. At WorldatWork, she leads the development of learning and certification programs that shape the future of compensation and rewards for HR professionals worldwide. Today's talk hits close to home for many of us. As HR leaders, we're constantly trying to do what's best for our teams, but sometimes even well-meaning compensation practices can quietly erode trust, equity, or motivation. She brings sharp insight, real-world perspective, and just the right amount of humor. Please join me in welcoming Marta Turba.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and congratulations on 15 years. That's amazing. So it's great to be here today. I had the pleasure to meet most of you kind of just networking around sessions yesterday, and I can just tell that the connections that are being made and the great insights that are being shared are really sparking a lot of conversation, and I hope that that continues this morning. We're here today to talk about this concept of first do no harm. Who knows this as like a medical oath, right? Right. Well, today, for the next hour, it's going to be our oath. It's going to be our HR mantra. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the unintended consequences of seemingly good decisions that we make about pay that sometimes go sideways. Sometimes we can't anticipate these things. Maybe it's poor execution, maybe it's people being people, or maybe business circumstances change. But harm happens, and we have to know how to spot it and how to recover from it, and that's what our discussion today is about. I want to give you just a brief story. It's probably going to sound really familiar because it's ripped from recent headlines. I'm going to give you a disclaimer, first of all, that I do not own stock in Cracker Barrel, and I'm not a business analyst expert, but I have a lot of opinions, just like the hundreds of thousands of people that voiced their concerns and interest in the story of Cracker Barrel in the last month. So from where I'm sitting, this is my expert analyst perspective, Cracker Barrel had some business problems to solve, and they hired a very qualified CEO who had a track record of success. Julie, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name. I'm looking at my notes for her name. Well, they're not there. So her name is Julie, and she knows what she's doing, right? She did have a track record of success at other organizations and was brought into Cracker Barrel with one intent, and that was basically to revitalize the organization. They were facing a lot of competitive issues, and one of the things that they were struggling with was an aging customer base. So I'm sure there were a lot of strategies at play, but the one that made the news in August was a very bold rebranding strategy, right? There was a new aesthetic to many of their restaurants, there was a changed logo, and there was a really big decision to remove the beloved old-timer from the signage, right? And you know, that old-timer probably had some symbolism in marketing terms. I know that in the best marketing teams, they talk about this branding stuff for hours and hours and hours. But to the Cracker Barrel community or customer community, I think that that symbolized something of great importance. It was all about the nostalgia. It was about comfort. And it was ripped away. And what happened next was probably every CEO's nightmare, I'm guessing. There was backlash, almost immediate backlash, right? The customers revolted. Even the former founder went publicly and said, this is a really bad idea. And what do you do when you're in that situation? Well, you kind of have two choices. You can hunker down on your decision and say, you know what? This is best for the long term, and we're going to be in it for the long haul. Or you can do what they did, and they listened. They listened to their customers. They compromised on a few things. They didn't compromise on everything. I mean, there was a slew of changes that were introduced. But the one thing that they compromised on and really quickly pivoted on was the return of that old-timer to the logo. Now, what did that cost the business? Well, it cost the business really a lot. This whole exercise cost the business a lot, right, in terms of lost sales and brand reputation. But I can tell you this, I've never been to a Cracker Barrel, and I've also never once talked about Cracker Barrel in the last 15 years. I think it opened up a whole new audience space. That's just my perspective. But it was bigger than that. I think it was a really good example of leadership and pivoting when things go wrong. when things don't go as intended. And that's kind of what we're here today to talk about. We design great comp programs every day, and we do a lot of things right. If we do 100 things, probably 99% of them are right. But at times, they don't land as well as they could. So what we're going to do today is dive into the 5 hidden harms that you may have lurking beneath the surface of your comp programs, and identify, first of all, how to spot it, second, what to do about it, and how you can get to a state where your practices are feeling good, they're feeling technically sound, but more importantly, they also feel good. And that sounds like a very non-comp term, but the way these programs make your workforce feel and the confidence that they bring to your managers, that's just as important as the compensation goals. So that's what we're here to talk about. I want to just dive into the concept of what do I mean by harm. I actually really love this definition that's on the screen. I think it's a very good way to capture how harm shows up. It's not just that people are unhappy, although that could be some of the signs. It's more like the quieter kind of things that sneak in when our comp programs are just missing the mark. It may look like lack of engagement. It may look like more declined offers. It may look like your best performers walking out the door. It might look like you not being able to make your set budgets. There's a lot of different ways this harm could show up. It could even show up in legal and assumed risk issues. Spotting these signals early and knowing what the real issues are versus just the signals and just the noise, that's really the skill that we're here to kind of develop today. Dig into the root causes and make choices that support both the people in the organization. So if I take a look at these things on the screen, how many of you deal with these on a daily basis? Are they common? You hear a little bit about them? Not really. Okay, so pay is never surfacing in conversations in your organization. So mainly the conversations that you're in regarding pay are, thank you so much for my pay level. I really appreciate it. Is that the nature of the feedback that you're getting from your workforce? Okay. All right, low pay is a pretty common thing to come up. Bad plan design is also a good thing that comes up a lot. I get a lot of WorldatWork customer inquiries basically saying, okay, I'm getting a lot of flack for our incentive plans. I think they're designed pretty well, but at the end of the day, they paid out and our organization didn't hit our goals, so there's something wrong there, right? Too much structure? Too little structure? Do you hear any feedback about structure in your organizations? Yeah? What do you hear? Interesting. So it has to do with your org design and your job levels and that kind of thing? Okay, fantastic. Lack of market data. Now, we all know that we have good sources of market data, especially in this room, right? But do you ever lack market data? Or do people ever not understand your market data? Or do people expect too much from your market data? That's kind of one of the things I hear a lot about. And HR jargon. HR, and this is just like the shorthand of HR came up with a great plan, and somehow our managers just are not absorbing it. So these are the things that, for the most part, the customers I'm talking to, this is what their email box looks like. This is the things that surface that need immediate attention. These are the topics of one-on-one discussions, Slack conversations. This is where energy is being spent, right? But you know what? From my perspective, these are actually more just symptoms. They're kind of like the tip of the iceberg. They're not really the root cause of harm in most comp programs. So the question is, if your problem's not low pay, or maybe it is. I mean, it's possible that your pay is too low in your organization to be competitive. But a lot of times when somebody states that, we have a problem with low pay, it has more to do with, I don't understand my pay, I don't understand how it was set, I don't understand how to earn more. That's just an example. When there's a problem with market data, usually the discussions on market data are really deep on the HR side because we're the ones that understand the market data and what we're hoping for it to accomplish. When we start to get feedback on market data from our leaders, usually there's different routes to that. Like, for example, maybe we're putting too much weight on the market data, and it goes up and down and causes mistrust and things like that. These things are all real things that we deal with each and every day. But there are some bigger things. We're going to just dive a little bit past these surface issues and dig into the hidden harm. So the things that aren't so obvious, right? The things that undermine your comp strategy while you're busy chasing down better market data or trying to get a better merit matrix out there, okay? The real hidden harm is in 5 areas. This is where we get into the good stuff, right? Raise your hand at any point if you can, relate to this, if you think you might have some of these harms in your system, or maybe this is the first time you're considering some of it. Complexity creep. I love structure. I grew up in compensation, right? So I have an appreciation for well-designed programs, well-designed job structures, and things that can scale on a large level. But in doing that, it's a risk to make things too complex. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But if you don't get a handle on the complexity in your pay plans, it can undermine all your goals. Second, illusions of equity. Most people in HR have an appreciation for equality, for doing the right thing, for making things fair for the workforce, even though I know that fair is an abstract concept, kind of hard to accomplish sometimes. But there are certain practices out there, especially pay practices, that are set up for the right reasons, but actually don't create an equal environment at all. And we're going to dive into some of those. Maybe together we'll look at those and figure out which ones it may be time to let go of. Third miss in compensation programs, the things that are causing harm, is when we overlook the power of recognition. In many ways, non-cash recognition has a lot more power, even than cash-based recognition. Too many times it's looked as like an add-on or a simple thing, and it causes a big miss because it's the opportunity that most effectively reinforces what you're trying to accomplish in your organizations. Best practice turned bad policy. Anybody here have any policy at all in their organization that they're hanging on to, not because you think it's really delivering a great result, but because it's a little bit of a sacred cow, nobody wants to really touch it? Oh, I'm impressed. Congratulations. What's an example? How about, why does this segment of employees have 7 weeks of vacation? Oh, the answer is because we acquired that organization in 1988, and we decided to honor their PTO program. We haven't wanted to sunset it because that doesn't seem fair. So we're just waiting until the employees from that workforce either retire or leave our organization.
Marta, all VPs are in the same grade.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because they're all the same. Yeah, absolutely. And then if you have inflated job levels, that creates a double whammy, right? So best practices, and I will criticize a lot of these practices, but I'll tell you right now, I've triggered some of these practices because they seem like a great decision at the time. But then somehow they became like so embedded and these things that aren't agile enough to change. So we're going to dive into some of that. And then the last cause of harm within your pay systems could be undermining leaders. And we talked a little bit about that concept yesterday, but we're going to dive into that a little bit later. And I'm going to explain it later as well, because it may not be exactly what you're thinking. So let's start with complexity creep. Who here thinks pay is complex? I do too, absolutely. I don't want to apologize for it. I think pay should be complex because in most organizations, your reward programs and pay account for more than 70% of your overall labor cost and expense line. So to some degree, I would expect a level of rigor and science and active management and optimization around that investment. And that's not a simple process. Of course, there's tools out there that make it more simple each and every day. But the stakes are high, and it deserves a certain amount of thought to manage and work through the complexity issues. But I think our roles as leader is to really cut through the things that should be complex and the things that should be simple. It's as easy as that. So just take a simple example, like incentive plans. Are they complex? Well, it is complex. If you ask me to sit down and redesign an incentive plan that aligns to a business strategy and has a self-funding mechanism and has an appropriate threshold and represents the right goal achievement level, those are really complex inputs, and it'll take me a while to do that, and that's okay. That's complex work, and that is the work that we're doing. That's how we make an organizational impact. But at the time we take that work and deliver it to our core customer base, whether that be employees or managers, it can't be complex at that point. It needs to be excessively clear and simple. They want to know what the plan is, what they need to achieve, and how it pays out. It's that easy. So our role becomes cutting through the complexity, right? Same happens with finding great market data. There is complexity in terms of figuring out what the right sources are, figuring out how to weight them, how to apply them in the best mix for your business, figuring out how to make sense of all of the new accessible resources that are out there, maybe powered through AI, whether you trust them, whether you don't trust them. There's a lot of judgment that comes into that. That is a complex input. That's our input, right, in HR. That's where we focus. But by the time we leverage that market data to help managers make decisions, they need the simplicity. They need the what, the why, and what do I need to do? So that's what we're really aiming here to do when we talk about cutting through complexity. So complexity shows up differently. And these may make you laugh, they may make you cry. I'm not sure what the level of complexity that you have within your organization. Does anybody have a job family that you think has maybe 3 levels too many? Anybody? Okay, great. Anybody here have what I like to refer to as twin jobs? So these are, one job exists in the organization, and then a manager comes in with a very special job with a very special name. And it must be created in a different area of the organization, but it's not enough to use that single job code. So we basically have twin jobs, different names, same function. Anybody have any of that? That used to be a big risk that I saw in a lot of plans, especially in mergers and acquisitions. People seem to cherish, oops, sorry for the hand gesture. People cherish their job titles, and sometimes you don't want to mess with them. And sometimes the decision not to mess with them really wreaks havoc on your job structure, and that eventually has a down the road impact on how people are viewing their career paths. Fuzzy guidelines. How many here have a pay practices manual in your organization that you actually publish for managers and say if you want to promote somebody, you can do it during these months, and this is the performance guidelines and that kind of thing? Do you publish guidelines? Little bit? Good job. Do they work well?
Fairly new, so we're getting used to it.
Okay, getting used to it. That's great. That's how you initiate change. For those of you that don't publish guidelines, why don't you? What's holding you back? Hey, I heard it's too hard? It's too complex. Because oftentimes the answer to our guidelines are it depends, right? And that's not overly helpful to leaders that are trying to figure out what the right thing to do in a certain situation is. So complexity shows up as the words, it depends. Now, sometimes it really does depend, but let's go with the 80-20 rule there. 80% of practices should be pretty prescriptive, and you have pretty clear guardrails with a certain amount of flexibility built in. The 20% are those bigger, higher stakes issues can be the it depends answer. The deal with complexity is that it feels different depending on which chair you're sitting in. If you're a manager, a complex pay system feels like, well, maybe handcuffs, right? It might feel like a lot of rules, but often they feel like ambiguous rules that they don't quite understand. So there's a little bit of fear that ekes into this. They probably have a desire to make really good decisions, but don't exactly know what they're authorized to do, what they're not authorized to do. And that shows up in a lot of ways. And the worst way, and this kind of relates to one of the sessions yesterday, the worst way is inaction, right? So you're a manager, you kind of know you have some comp issues, you probably should be proactive about dealing with them. You don't really know how to initiate it. Sometimes you think that HR's processes are a little bit of a hassle, and therefore, let's just push them down the road. That person seems happy, let's deal with it during the next merit cycle, right? Those are some of the hidden harms that just creep in because your complexity is feeling like a burden to the people who are accountable to use the pay systems. Now flip over to employees. Employees feel complexity of pay systems a little differently. If they understand the pay system, they may see it as great opportunity. They know where their career could take them within your organization. But a lot of times, and I think I remember this from yesterday, we had a show of hands and there were maybe about a quarter of you doing like pay transparency through job postings. Does that sound right? Raise your hands if you're doing that. Okay, those are typically the most transparent organizations, whether it's regulated or not. But employees learn a lot about the pay system through that. Also, obviously, any internal education that you're giving. But for most organizations, even organizations that do pay training really, really well and think that they're covering all the bases, a lot of times that pay system isn't real, it's not real life for employees. They don't really see themselves in it. They may be able to see where their career could go next, or they may have interest in where something will take them long term down the road. But a lot of times, they kind of they look to their manager first for the leadership and the discussions and the engagement on pay issues. That's the first thing. And you know, if that manager doesn't have a lot of confidence, those discussions aren't going very far. So from an employee standpoint, it actually starts to feel, pay complexity actually starts to feel like being left out, which is really funny because I know that so many of us work on strategies for belonging in the workplace and high engagement. And it was really revealing to me after talking with a few of our customers that belonging really does show up through pay. It's not the only way, it's not the primary way, but from an employee standpoint, they have to feel like they're involved in the discussions that matter to their livelihood. And if you don't, that's a belonging signal, right? So then complex pay systems show up totally differently for HR and comp groups. Feels a little bit like chaos. It starts at a really good level. You start with a great design, and then you maybe have some good systems to support that design. And then you have a lot of special requests from leaders who need special programs in their area. And you're a very accommodating group, so you tailor some things. And then you try to keep those things going, and they realize it's kind of hard to scale through systems, so you have like the sideline spreadsheets. And then it's time to hire in those areas, and you can't really remember what are we doing for those job families, like what's the deal that we cut. That complexity tends to compound. And what that means from an HR standpoint, well, it's a lot of work, and it's best to avoid that work if we can, right? But bigger than that, it's a distraction because it puts you into almost full-time firefighting mode to manage all the workarounds and the special situations. You're spending a lot less time on strategy and a lot more time just dealing with the day-to-day issues, which it is part of all of our roles to do that, but it shouldn't be the primary part of the leader role. So the point here is that complexity feels different, it doesn't feel good to pretty much anybody. So it's pretty hard to make a business case for a complex pay system with that information. So the question is, what do you do about it? Here are just some simple hints. First, look at the purpose of any pay practice that you have. My background, early in my career, I dealt with mergers and acquisitions in financial services, and I was with an organization that over like a 3-year period, we did about 30 acquisitions. And we were really great at due diligence. I had this whole spiel. I met with the leadership team and the HR teams of these target organizations, and we really dove into their pay practices. And we did it at a few different levels. We looked in their handbooks. We had conversations. Then we looked in their payroll system, and that was really telling. Hey, it looks like we actually have pay practices in our payroll system that don't show up in the handbook. What's the story on these? Those are all those special situations that you don't find out about, right? So what was interesting about those conversations was not just that, there's a lot to uncover and there's a lot to honor and integrate, because there was, but I think what was telling was there was nobody at the table that could actually articulate what the purpose of some of those things were. So for example, I see that we have shift differentials in place. Great. The shift differentials seem to be higher for this job category than this job category. What's the reason there? Was there a market difference? Was there a hiring challenge? There weren't a lot of answers to this. There were a lot of legacy practices that continued to be honored simply because it was really hard to take things away. So starting with the purpose of whatever you're producing is a great place to start. At lunch yesterday, somebody gave me an example of what they're calling, and I can't wait to read the book, the reverse, what was it, the reverse pilot. So basically, you're doing all these things in HR, and let's start to take some things away and see if anybody misses them. I think it's a great concept. That experimentation becomes really important when you're trying to zone in and simplify. Number 2, simplify your levels and structures. Who here believes that their pay structure is just about right? Like simple enough, people understand it, it's working. It's a good thing. Did you get there immediately or did it take some time? Yeah, did you start simple or did you start complex and make it simple?
I would say we started simple.
Okay, very good.
Everybody else come.
There you go. Okay, that's a fantastic plug. Find the right partner, and they will help you implement. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of robust job systems out there. Sometimes that complexity is required to manage, but sometimes it's not. Here's an example of, you gave an example, Christy, previously of having all your VPs in one job grade. Some people might call that very simple. That's not really the type of simplicity that I'm advocating for, though, because it's not simple. Somewhere behind the scenes, I can almost guarantee that somebody's market pricing, shadow market pricing each one of those roles, and probably doing manual pay recommendations for that whole C-suite. So, it doesn't really work to have that level. So simple's good, but finding that right balance is good too. Streamlining incentives. Anybody here have incentive problems in their organizations? Yeah? What are the problems?
We recently, the retail banking side started an incentive plan that the retail leaders made, which makes sense if they don't any, but they keep changing it.
Yes.
And it's like, how confused do you think that your bankers and tellers are? If their incentives constantly change.
That's the biggest problem that I hear from our customers too. They have a pretty good idea of incentives and they're ushering it in, but then they keep changing the measurements, even if it's changed on an annual basis in a way that's very fair. I mean, mid-year changes, so that's a whole different ball of diminished trust. But changing even on an annual basis, at some point employees are just gonna tune out. They're gonna just hope for the best. I had this experience, it was really kind of telling. I was out over Labor Day weekend on a boat, so trapped, right? Anybody here have family and friends that believe because you're in HR, you are a 24/7 career coach? Yeah? I'm usually happy to help, especially if I can help, but a lot of times I can't. So I'm a good listener, and I listen to my cousin who is very, very, very unhappy in his role. And he tried to describe why he was hanging on because he has an incentive plan and it wouldn't be prudent to leave at this time. That's great, I understand it. I asked him more about what was on the table and he went on to describe, he didn't really know how many incentive plans he was on. He might be on 3. He doesn't exactly know what he needs to do to get a payout, but he's pretty sure one of them's gonna pay out. He's gonna have to ask Joe about that. So at the end of the day, I said, well, my comp advice for you would be to buy a lottery ticket because it seems more dependable and at least those rules are published on the back of the ticket. You always know how that system works. So employees have to understand, please don't quote me publicly on that, okay? But you have to streamline incentives so people understand them. At the baseline, it's not just a way to have market competitive compensation. It's supposed to be motivating the right behaviors. And fixing communication gaps. Communication gaps happen all over the place, and it's not due to lack of communication, oftentimes. Anybody ever hear that quote that the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has occurred, right? Look at it this way. Pretend like you are rolling out maybe your annual salary planning process and guidance for merit increases and that kind of thing. And you have excellent communications. You couldn't be prouder of your team. The training of your managers has been really positive. People seem to understand it. They seem to engage. That is a fantastic day of communication. The whole composition of your organization may change in 2 weeks. You may have people who come and go. You might have different market forces at play. So that need for constant reinforcement is really, it's real. All right. Illusions of equality. Within our pay systems, there is hidden harm when we standardize things that have disparate impact on certain groups. Not necessarily discrimination. I'm not necessarily speaking of discriminatory practices. I'm talking about like the companies that are really following what is considered best and equitable practices in comp. So let's just take a look in general about like a company that they're mandated or they've chosen to publish the salary ranges for all the jobs that they're recruiting for. They have a great interview process. They are publishing the salary ranges. They have a onboarding plan. They're going to set people up for success. They're coming on board. They go through this process and they hire a superstar candidate. The candidate actually is coming in with experience, which is amazing. They don't often find people with experience. The recruiter at the table follows the rules. They hire that person at the minimum of the salary range. Okay, is it the biggest misstep? Maybe not, because the person accepted the offer. It's higher than their last position. You know, that's kind of how some of those things evolve. But if you reference what that salary range guidance that was given yesterday, that salary range is supposed to represent an array of competence in your role, right? So probably if they had previously performed this role, maybe they should have been brought in at a higher level. But that's okay. It's you know what, I'll call that nuance, right? Because what you have is you have a great new employee that's excited about their opportunity. They're earning more than they did in the past. The manager is thrilled. They hit the ground running. They're a high performer. 8 months down the road, the employee says, you know what, let's have a talk because I'd really like to take on more responsibility. I'd like to move up. I'd like to take on special projects. What can we work out? Well, that conversation starts to go like, great. Manager has lots and lots of needs and is looking to have people who can step up to meet some of those needs. But guess what? There's a policy in the organization that you have to stay in your current role for at least a year. That's the duration, the stay period that was established as like the norm, right? So they delay this promotion for about 4 months. It's okay, they have good communication during that time. The employee's happy that something's coming. It works out. So the time of promotion comes. There is a great announcement about the fact that this employee has been promoted and in this new role they'll be accountable for X, Y, Z. The employee starts to realize that, you know what, I've actually been doing X, Y, Z for about 6 to 8 months. That's kind of interesting. So a little bit of eroded trust there. But in the new role, they got a raise. They didn't get a huge raise, though. They got a 10% raise, which doesn't sound bad. But remember, they were hired at the minimum of the last salary range. So that 10% range doesn't even get them into the salary range of their new role. And that's all best practice, okay? That's all best practice. The salary range structure is best practice. The hiring guideline is best practice. And these are the equality things that are backfiring. So there needs to be some level of truth and guidance and just fact checking to make sure that equality stays part of your comp systems, because those guidelines don't always get you to the end result that you're hoping for. So the best advice there is to stop chasing the equality, promise. Transparency is an excellent place to start. Whether or not you're required by law to have transparent salary ranges in your job postings, how many of you do have, let's just say, transparency and salary ranges for your managers? Like, how many of your managers have visibility into the salary ranges within at least their teams or the organization? Their teams, for sure? Okay, very bright lights here, so, okay, fantastic. That level of transparency is important. There can be transparency at an employee level too. How many of you think that your employees know the salary range for the job that they are in? Maybe about a quarter that I'm seeing, okay. And how many know the salary range for the next job in their career path? A little bit. If their career path is a little defined, it's more likely to be revealed. Well, transparency is a noble goal. It's just an activity. And you know what I love about pay transparency? When I joined WorldatWork 6 or 7 years ago, there was this huge debate about whether pay should be transparent. You know, it was a debate. It was literally a yes or no type of discussion. I love that the regulatory environment has just stopped all of that debate. The answer is transparent organizations have more trust in their pay systems. That's just the way it is. And I also think that the excuses, particularly of the comp teams, not necessarily the HR teams that I work with, but comp teams have fear because they like perfection. And when they look at their pay systems, obviously we see it all. We know that those systems aren't perfect, and they don't want to, open up the hood and share it with everybody. But the reality, which is proven time and time and time again, employees care about themselves. They don't care about the organization's pay system. They kind of want to know that you have a philosophy and that you have some integrity to pay for what you say is important. But when it comes to revealing transparency, they care about themselves and their careers. They aren't going to make these drastic comparisons across the organization or really take any time to do any layer of analysis. So I think my best advice for our customers, particularly on the comp side, is I think we just kind of need to get over ourselves and take a risk and see what happens. And you know what? If it doesn't go well, we can be like Cracker Barrel and we can pivot and rebuild some trust quickly, right? Rewarding contribution, not presence. Now, the next session covers pay for performance, and I can't wait to hear more about it because this is it's a puzzle. Most organizations say they pay for performance. Most employees want to know that they are seen and valued and that their performance matters. But the reality of the budgets that we work in is that most pay for performance models can't really stand up through base pay alone. Merit matrices do help, but if you really do the math behind that, if somebody's earning $60,000 a year, the monetary difference between somebody who exceeds expectations and meets expectations is $600. Does that warrant the discretionary effort? Does that warrant the late nights, the taking on extra assignments, more stress? Not really. We're really not doing a great job of aligning pay and performance unless we're bringing in incentive programs that matter. So to some extent, figuring out how to reward contribution more than presence is really key to helping people think that they're being seen through their comp programs. And then ultimately, and this sounds like common sense, and I'm wondering if you've had any experiences that have just backfired. We have to build good systems. We have to build systems that our leadership team will pass, our boards will be happy with, but they also have to feel fair to people. I want to give you an example, and I'm doing this in the privacy of our group, but I worked with a customer. I'll call it a customer, a friend, right? And they were a really successful organization, small employer, having a great bang-up year, and the executive team really wanted to do something to recognize the workforce. And they decided around Memorial Day that let's give the entire workforce off every Friday afternoon. Hadn't been discussed before, but they quickly put together a summer hours program where nobody worked past noon in their time zone on Fridays. Great. So you can imagine that was really, really well received. On a lot of levels. First of all, everybody loves time off, but second, employees felt seen. They felt like their hard work was really being recognized. And it worked great for about 3 weeks. And then the manager had this situation. They were contacted by an HR leader saying, hey, you know what? I'm noticing that one of your employees has taken off Friday morning, but they only coded 4 hours in the payroll. You need to get that changed to 8 hours. And the manager said, well, I'm not really understanding. Everybody in the organization's off in the afternoon, so that would be 4 hours. They need to be out for a medical appointment that morning, so that would be 4 hours. And they said, no, that's not really how we designed that program. If you're taking off in the morning on Fridays, you take off 8 hours, and if not, then you work. Didn't feel right. So, but the manager's a supportive manager, didn't go back to the employee with the HR made me do it. But went back to the employee and explained the situation. And the employee literally put it in writing saying, let me just understand this. If I go to the doctor on Thursday morning, I should take 4 hours of PTO. If I go to the doctor on Friday morning, I should take 8 hours of PTO. Unfortunately, that was the exact correct explanation for that policy. It didn't feel fair. It undermined all the goodwill that was built in that program. So this is just like the human test. There's no technical approach to this, but just make sure things are feeling fair. And stop those practices that are preventing inequity within your organization. I'm sorry, preventing equity within your organization. So for example, what about pay schedules or flexibility in schedules? I'm not sure if that's a challenge within your organizations, but I'm guessing, how do you balance the fact that at times exempt employees can have a lot more flexibility in hours than front-facing, customer-facing employees that might be paid on a non-exempt basis? That's probably one of the complaints that I hear about the most, and it's a really hard one to navigate. There's not everybody's navigating it within the letter of the law, but it doesn't always feel fair to employees. It erodes the compensation, intent and impact. Let's shift to recognition. How many here love the recognition programs? Okay, let's start easier than that. You don't have to love them. How many have recognition programs? And I'm talking about non-cash recognition programs. Okay. And if you don't have programs, do you feel like you have regardless of whether you have a program, how do you feel about your culture in terms of recognizing the things that matter within your workforce? Doing a good job? Working at it a little bit? Okay, some people are confident in this. Recognition to me, and I'm offering a lot of non-scientific perspective here, more like practical perspective. To me, recognition is the lever that doesn't get played enough in the compensation equation. In some ways, it's incredibly more powerful than even pay, but it gets a bad rap, not because people don't want to do it, but because they don't operationalize it, they don't become intentional about it, and because there's this reputation that recognition is actually easy. It's hard to argue with the need for recognition in our workforce, so are we focused enough on recognition? Well, recognition programs can cause hidden harm within your pay systems. Now, and I'm not going to drive, or I'm not going to talk about cash recognition. I really just want to focus on non-cash right now. The biggest harm is if you don't have recognition within your culture. If you don't have recognition, all of a sudden, you might see your pay ratcheting up because you try to make up for, I'll call it bad behavior, not recognizing great work, I will call it bad behavior. You ratchet up pay to account for that, and that's really not ideal, okay? The other harm that can surface within recognition programs is rewarding the wrong things or rewarding the wrong people. Anybody ever had a circumstance where maybe a colleague or a department gets recognized for their amazing work and you look at it and you go, oh my gosh, I should really be recognizing my people if this is the bar for recognition in our organization? Anybody have that experience? Is it only me? There's nothing that gets me as a leader more in tune with the need to recognize my employees than to see other leaders recognizing their employees for lesser work. I'll just come out and say it. That's really an awful thing to say, but it's an important thing. Because when the wrong behaviors or the wrong people, not that wrong people are being recognized, I think everybody needs recognition. If somebody's employed with you and they're performing, and they're contributing to your result, there's something you can recognize for almost everybody, and it makes sense to do so. It's good business practice. So the pitfalls that come with recognition the most often, like where does it go off the rails? Well, the biggest place it goes off the rails is just kind of like by leaving it to chance, not really having a vision for what recognition should mean within your organization. It should be written into your compensation philosophy, what you recognize with pay, what you recognize what you value from your workforce. Sometimes it's competencies, sometimes it's behavior, sometimes it's softer things like collaboration and teamwork and support of others, customer experience. There's any number of things that might be important to your business, but having that clear vision does two things. It kind of removes the randomness of the recognition experience, and it also allows you to drive more of the behaviors that you're hoping to incent. that also relates to connecting it with culture. Leaders have to be bought in and brought into recognition efforts. Does anybody work with a leader in their organization that they really admire how well they recognize their staff and how intentional they are about doing so? Anybody? Tell me what that looks like.
Well, you have both sides, and what amazes me is there are units that just run so well, departments that run so well, and you know that that manager is consistently offering the feedback and it is public through our WOW recognition. But then there are other managers who just don't utilize it, and you can see there's a difference there.
Yeah.
Within that department, and we've had conversations about, you know, in particular managers, I mean, everyone can recognize anyone, but in particular managers that it has to be part of, you know, their competencies, but it just hasn't taken off, and I mean, there are definitely two sides of that coin.
Absolutely. And you said early on something that was really important. It's good to be great at recognition, right? But it also opens the door. Typically, the leaders that are good at recognition are often good at giving feedback. Positive feedback for sure, but also constructive feedback. And if they aren't, at least they have the open door to do so because they've built a lot of trust by really being engaged with what the contributions of employees are and how they're impacting the organization. So that absolutely is a clear area. Now, peer-to-peer recognition is so meaningful to employees, and it's also one of the reasons that people stay with organizations, right? There's that Gallup, the Gallup engagement poll. I think there's the question, one of the standard 12 that says, I have a best friend at work. I remember just decades ago when I first saw that, I thought that was the corniest thing because I loved my job and I didn't like any of my coworkers. But the truth is, when you do have a best friend at work, if you have people that truly see you at work, you don't have to be best of friends outside of work, but you have respect and you have collaboration and you have peer-to-peer recognition. That all like forms a web, and that's a secure web that really contributes to retention strategies. Now, when you want to recognize peer-to-peer recognition, the best thing you can do is set up the culture that does it, that demonstrates it, that makes it normal, and empowers people to do it. And you know, sometimes it's a little less about funding. Maybe it's a little bit about training people or setting an expectation or really just giving permission. And really, it's a big culture driver, so it makes a big difference. A day late and a dollar short. I work for an organization that actually does recognition really, really well. Most of the leaders are doing it real time in their groups. And we have a pretty active like Slack channel that you hear about a lot going on in the organization. But then there's this layer of structure. And I just kind of sit back and see how it plays out because I know everybody's being recognized. But the structure around this is you recognize within your teams, but then you also submit it at an organizational level. So then on a quarterly basis, there is kind of a deep dive by an employee-led committee to talk about business impact and then pick 3 or 4 people who should be recognized for true impact that quarter. And that's been a pretty successful program, but what I've noticed more and more is, you hear from the people after they're getting recognized. And I've heard things like, honestly, I can't remember doing that. Or, yeah, that happened like last quarter, so yeah. And, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. That recency effect really does matter. If you want your recognition to matter, it has to be in a realistic window that really shows the employee that you're seeing them in the moment in a way that matters to them. Recognition should be more about behavior, in my opinion, than being over-indexed on output. So what I mean by that is I tend to like to talk more about non-cash recognition in this sense. If we're talking about cash on the table, I'll call it an incentive plan or maybe even a spot bonus program. But confusing revenue production, profitability with recognition, like that doesn't, typically there are incentive plans in place to take care of those more important KPIs. most of the time recognition is best when it's centered on behaviors. So is it worth fixing? I mean, we kind of seem like we had some mediocre reactions here to current state of recognition in your organization. If you had 2 goals this year, you could only do 2 things, or 1 thing. Would you dive deeper into your pay programs, or would you dive deeper into your recognition programs? Those are your 2 choices. I know there's none of the above, but which one? Everybody's going to have a different answer based on where your organization is at. But employees say that recognition is worth fixing. 90% of employees basically say they have higher engagement, they have motivation to have extra effort if recognition is strong. Teams that are recognized have higher productivity. 82% of employees say that meaningful monthly recognition makes them enthusiastic about their jobs. There's not a lot of enthusiasm, even with great pay programs. You may get day 1 enthusiasm, but recognition is the gift that keeps on giving. So in some ways, it delivers a greater impact. So if this is an area that you're interested in building out a little bit more, how do you go about doing it? First, really figure out how recognition is happening in your organization. You probably know about certain practices in certain departments, you know about your policies, but take an inventory, figure out and talk to employees, see how they are being recognized. You may be surprised about the practices that exist already, and you can build upon those. Figure out the right balance of cash and non-cash, and this should be actually explicit in your compensation philosophy. Somehow crack the nut on how to make it routine. Everybody says that they want a culture of recognition, and then everybody also says they're way too busy to have a culture of recognition. So you got to figure out how to make it like real every day. I have a leader of education, our education team at WorldatWork, who every single Friday, I know that she's recognizing something. She does schedule it. She has to schedule it. Her life is very busy. Does it seem less authentic because it's scheduled? Well, I guess yes, but it also means that every week she's reflecting on the good contributions of her team, and that does feel authentic. That's authentic leadership. I'm going to put in a plug, not necessarily for any single platform, but for those that are taking recognition really seriously and wanting to scale it in your organization in a way that's easy for managers, that gives them support tools, and can really scale across a diverse workforce. Think about having a platform to help you with that. Homegrown systems do work, but the ease of recognition, removing any barrier that makes it hard to deliver recognition, and anything that amplifies the impact of recognition, that matters. Train your delivery team. That's a really weird way to say, who is delivering this recognition? It's probably every single person in your organization. If you care about a culture of recognition, everybody, employees, managers, HR teams, everybody needs to be at the table for it. And the beauty, especially if you choose to use a system to scale some of your recognition efforts, you're collecting data. So you can always take a look at what is being recognized before you implement a program and after and along the way. And you can make pivots, and you can see how well it's aligned to your business intent if you're rewarding the right people and the right teams and the right things. So that's the best tip for strengthening recognition. It's a powerful, powerful force. It's not just about making people feel good, okay? It's about making your organization perform better. And if you can do recognition in a way that feels authentic and equitable and embedded into your business practices, it becomes a way to really accelerate your culture. All right, we've already touched on the topic a little bit when we were talking about equitable practices, but best practices in compensation sometimes drive bad policy. And they could drive more harm than good. I mentioned a few in passing previously. How many have something called stay periods, or you might call them something else, that basically say somebody has to remain in a job for a certain amount of time before they move on to the next? Anybody? I'm looking below the lights. Okay, I'm seeing about 25% of people. So I don't mean to attack that practice because it very well may work well in your organization. Anybody care to share how well it's working? Please.
Ours
6 months. Okay.
I think generally it's usually a measure of sometimes people appear more competent in your resume interviews and then they get into the role.
Yes.
Not that they can't perform the role, but you expect them to come in and really hit the ground running and they don't. So it's maybe they're lacking some skills at the top.
Okay, so that limit is in place to kind of set some realistic expectations with them that it takes a while to learn the role. Fair enough. Good. I grew up with stay programs in, my background was in public accounting. It worked really well there, but it was the least complex pay system I've ever seen in my whole career. Anybody here have a background in public accounting? You literally hired as an associate, and you are an associate for 18 months, and then you are promoted. And if you are not promoted, you are exited. Then you are a senior associate for 2 years. And if you are not promoted at the end of 2 years, you are exited. It's a very simplistic pay structure. So stay periods worked in that environment. But I see in other environments exactly what you described. You don't always know the talent that you're getting. So sometimes it's below the level that you think you're hiring and there needs to be more of a ramp up. But sometimes you have the exact opposite. You hire somebody and you realize after they're in the role for like 3 months that they would be amazing on the marketing team. We should really think about what we can do to make that happen. That level of flexibility becomes more and more important in skill-based environments. So you may need to take a look at some of the policies if they're not continuing to serve you. Let's talk about some of those red flags versus green flags in these best practices. And again, if you have any of these practices in place, I am criticizing them, but please know that I always know that certain practices work well in certain business environments. I think my criticism comes in terms of be sure that you're looking at them very carefully to make sure that they're really serving your purpose. So first, stay periods. We just talked about that. Minimum salary range hires. Anybody hire new hires at the minimum of the salary range? It's never a problem if you do, because I have no idea how wide your salary ranges are. If you tell me that you have a 75% range spread, wow, that's going to be a really hard thing to manage long term. If you have really super narrow salary ranges, it's probably wonderful that you're hiring people at the minimum. I think the takeaway here is whatever you're choosing to do for new hires, make sure that you're considering not just the core rules, but also how that plays out in terms of internal equity and competence. And that puts a little bit of a burden on your recruiting teams to get to really understand the credited experience that somebody may come in with. Promotional guidelines. Anybody articulate or follow certain promotional guidelines? So for example, if somebody's promoted this year, they should get between an 8 or 10% increase. If you don't follow guidelines, how do you budget? Go ahead. You do follow those. Okay, great. Well, you know, that's kind of like the catch-22. You have to budget for promotions in some way, and I can't remember last time I had to budget for promotions in our workforce. I was budgeting like 1.5% of our salaries across the workforce, but you know that only, whatever it was, 20% of people got promoted on an annual basis, 10%, something like that, and it all came out in the end. But again, those arbitrary standards of like, you know, it's nice to have that guideline. It's a good starting point because you do want promotional increases to feel meaningful and realistic. Because remember, they can get promoted quite easily if they leave you, right? But at the other end of the spectrum, you have to actually, you know, say like, what does this do? And the biggest risk is not promoting people and giving them too big of an increase. The biggest risk is not giving them what they deserve and perpetuating pay equity issues within your pay system. Schedule and flexibility, we talked about that a little bit. Sameness and merit increases. Now this is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Reflect on your last pay cycle, and I will reflect on our last pay cycle as well. How many organizations had a system where everybody got the same pay increase, merit increase? We did. Okay, we did across the board increases. I have no problem with across the board increases. Sometimes they fit the need. However, I do have a problem calling them same merit increase, across the board merit increases, because they aren't merit increases. There is different performance and different contribution from each and every person in your organization. So in my mind, you either communicate and have a differentiated merit-based program, or you have a across the board sameness in your increase program. But those two things are not exactly the same. Why does that matter? Is it semantics? It's maybe a little bit of semantics, but this is also the things that create harm in your comp systems, right? When you say, just a second, we're all supposed to get the same raise, but I heard that Mary got an 8% increase. We aren't all supposed to get the same raise because we need to articulate if we intend to have a differentiated merit increase pay for performance system. So nothing inherently wrong with across the board increases unless you're disguising them as a different type of program. Pay equity audits. We all do our best to maintain internal equity. And when I was practicing, now the last time I was actually in a corporate compensation role was rewinding about 5 years. I do consulting work right now, but I do not necessarily sit in the workforce and do pay equity audits anymore. But I know that the challenge of pay equity audits is the ability to actually measure all the things that you're articulating in your pay philosophy. So you might say that you pay for competency and experience, but how do you actually measure and systematically audit that on a regular scale so you can actually address pay equity issues that are surfacing in your workplace? So best practice is definitely to have an eye on pay equity, operationalize it. Most organizations are building it into regular systems, like cycles, merit cycles, for example, that they do, and then they have some checkpoints throughout the year. But the key with pay equity and why it's a red flag, it's not a red flag to do it, it's a red flag to do it and not do anything about it. So I think if you've gone through a pay equity audit of any type, you're aware that that discovery process is hard work, but the real hard work comes in because it's actually a legal requirement that you address and remediate any pay equity issues that you surface. So it's a long journey, and it's one that needs more focus, and it is one that builds trust and transparency in your pay systems. Lastly, I'm just going to talk about grandfathering a little bit. Grandfathering or honoring legacy practice often seems like an easy road, and it's often not an equitable road in pay systems. So I would just basically say, let's look at those and make sure that we're not grandfathering things that we wouldn't invent if we had to. That can be your litmus test, right? If you're presented with something, maybe through a merger and acquisition, and you're being asked to grandfather it, would you ever in a million years create this for your workforce? If the answer is yes, maybe it's worth honoring for a while and figuring out what you want to do with it long term. But if not, make the bold move and lean into the employee value proposition that you're creating, because that's the thing with total rewards. There's probably a list of 50 things that people value in that employee experience, and there may be one line item that is less attractive at your employment opportunity than another, but they have to look at it in terms of the whole package, and you can help them do that. All right, last one. Let's talk real things here. Undermining leaders. How many struggle with leaders in their organization? Either because they don't have a lot of capability or they're just hard to work with. Yeah? Or they're too busy to work? You're the honest voice in the room. I appreciated your honesty on stage yesterday, too. Okay, we have two honest people. Lay it on me. What's the hardest thing about working with managers in your organizations?
Well, we all deal with it. Yes, we deal with it. But, I think with leaders, it has to do. A lot of our leaders, particularly in credit unions and in small financial institutions, they're working managers. So a lot of their focus is on the day-to-day as leads. They don't always spend time with their people or people metrics, correct?
I'm going to have you stand up if you don't mind.
Yeah, so, like I said, we deal with managers a lot, right?
Thank you.
Correct? Yes, we do. We do with managers a lot. And in credit unions and in smaller financial institutions, are you wearing multiple hats? Managers, right? They're doing multiple things. So people aren't always their thing that they're watching every day.
particularly about their compensation, except for one time a year, right? When they do their annual reviews. So is HR undermining leaders or not vice versa? I do think there's a sense that they feel like we don't necessarily always understand what they're going through, or they want to keep that employee. So I do think our leaders at time absolutely feel like we may be undermining their strategic plan or what their goal is if we're not in alignment on what we're trying to do. Is that what we're trying to talk
Yeah,
about?
absolutely. You cut to the chase. Very good. Thank
Right.
you. You know, the thing is, there is this pet peeve. We hate it, right? When leaders say, I'm not sure why you're paid that, you're going to need to talk to HR. Does that ever happen in your organizations? I reflected on that over the course of my career, okay, when I was like a young comp analyst, it just bugged me, okay, but I didn't do anything about it. I just thought ill of the managers that were doing it. And then in my mid-career, I actually took the bull by the horns and tried to hold people accountable. Hey, this is actually your job, right? We provide you with all the right pay systems, make good decisions, and if you don't make good decisions, or if you do, stand behind your decision. Tried to encourage those behaviors. Sometimes succeeded, didn't always succeed though, because you know what? I started to realize that the managers that are saying, I don't know why you're paid what you're paid, they weren't lying. They weren't like, I don't want to deal with this. They truly, truly didn't know. And the fact that, you know, we provided them with reams of paper to describe all of our pay programs, and we mandated that they go through 3 hours of training a year, all of that didn't really sink in, okay? So that was more of a Marta problem than a manager problem. And that started me thinking about this, you know, am I close enough to the business to know that my pay programs are actually supporting the business and not undermining what managers are trying to accomplish? So when we talk about like undermining leaders, we might think of those leaders that, you know, they're the last ones to turn things in. Maybe they always turn things in late. They blow the budget. They communicate something a little differently than maybe what we all agreed on, and then you're scrambling in the 11th hour. Those behaviors happen every single day. But if we flip that script, we can actually think about, you know, are we doing anything that unintentionally undermines their ability to drive performance and meet their goals? Because if you really like think about it, the needs of managers, even though we get a lot of requests, a lot of asks, I mean, the pressure's on, but at the heart of it, what they ask for is often quite simple. They want a pay program that's going to help them hire the right person. They want to be able to motivate their teams, and they want to be able to be confident that they're going to be able to retain people long enough to actually accomplish the goals of their area. So if our pay programs aren't exactly doing that, we might need to go back to the drawing board a little bit more. Doesn't mean that we have to redesign everything. We might need to support managers in a different way if the way we have is not necessarily landing. So if your pay systems are failing leaders, you're not likely going to hear about it in terms of like complaints or rioting from your management team. You're going to see kind of more subtle hints like missed comp tasks or blown budgets or ignored guidelines, more calls from employees saying, hey, can you explain this? My manager can't give me that information. You might notice that the tools that you pour your heart and soul into, like maybe merit matrices or talking scripts for meetings, they tend to go unused. In fact, employees might walk away with a totally different discussion. And ultimately, the biggest signal that comp programs might not be serving the intended purpose is that if you can't close the deal, if you can't get people excited about the career path that you're offering within the organization for your existing workforce, if you're getting more declined offers, that's a telltale sign that your comp's just not landing. And the people who make your comp land are the managers. So that means that that relationship needs to evolve and maybe be handled a little bit differently. Right now, according to some WorldatWork research, 50% of leaders say compensation is one of their biggest challenges to deal with. But only 1 in 5 say that they have confidence to do so. And that is actually a call to action. It's a call to action that we get really serious about with those people that are focused on compensation full time. Because unfortunately, a lot of times we misinterpret this need. We say, oh, you need more information? Well, let me provide it to you. I'm more than happy to provide you spreadsheets and analysis, and let me run a regression on that. And they don't need any of that, okay? They don't need the master class in how to design amazing compensation. They need the tools. First of all, they need confidence. They need confidence to be able to answer questions and just have authentic conversations without that overhanging fear of, I'm going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to make the wrong decision, and I don't even know if I can afford to make this decision. So those are the things that really matter to leaders. And if we take that as our call to action, that we're not here to communicate the ins and outs of all the comp programs, but rather that we're here to build more confidence with our leaders who have to be the ambassadors of the comp program, that makes a big difference. Now, when I came to WorldatWork, my background was in HR leadership, HR consulting, and total rewards leadership. And I was hired as the VP of Content Strategy. I can tell you, I really never once gave it any thought in my entire career about how to build content that matters for an audience. I'm kind of ashamed to say that. I was just so worried about designing pay programs that I didn't actually think about, this is how you tailor your messages to have the greatest impact. It also is an area that, it's really easy to learn, and in this day and age, digital content is everything, so you can become an expert quite quickly, so I was very grateful for that. But if I had some tips to offer to you, think of yourself as a content leader for your pay programs. You have to figure out how to get those messages to your target audience in a way that captures their attention. And their attention might be about the same as my attention on Instagram. I might give it 15, 30 seconds max, right? So simplify your messages, boil it down to exactly what they need to know. If it is a more complex system, by necessity, figure out a way to grab their attention and motivate them to engage further. Probably not through sponsorships, right? You're going to have to figure out a different strategy for that. More talking points, not more data. That's really what managers appreciate. They want to know that you know what you're doing, that our salary structures make sense, that we have good market data, but you don't have to bombard them with that information. They need the most help on the engaging conversations. Building flexibility into the framework becomes really, really important, so they aren't afraid that they're going out of bounds or going against some policy, because the more fear that's in that system, the less action they're likely to take. And action's better than inaction almost every time. If you can connect pay to what the managers care about, you know what the goals are in their department each year, figure out how you can connect on those conversations to say, you know what, if this is what you're aiming to accomplish, let's really revisit your talent plan. And if this is who you need, do we have the right pay systems in place to attract them and retain them? Having those really open conversations, ideally not when things are blowing up, not when things are in crisis, not during a cycle, but having those strategic conversations ongoing goes a really long way in building. It may or may not result in any change, but it results in a great relationship. And that means that when things do go south, when things unexpected happen, you have that relationship to get through that experience together. And bringing manager feedback into the process, this is almost like a given. Does anybody here have a concern that their managers are not bringing them feedback when they're unhappy with things? Okay, I think we're good. Even though you appreciate, I'm sure you appreciate that feedback, and you are confident that you're always going to get that feedback, go out of your way to solicit it. It shows confidence. It shows confidence in your program, and it shows that you have a continuous improvement mindset, even when you think things are running really well. And you know this from your work in employee relations and other HR endeavors. You never know what you might learn in that process. It's always valuable. So as we wrap up, most of us here didn't get into HR because we love to manage policies or stand up programs, right? We got here because we care a lot about making a difference in our organizations and in people's careers, and we care about fairness and equity in our workplace. So today's discussion was really about kind of looking at and isolating those things that might take our comp programs adrift from where we intended them to go. So as we are preparing to go back to our real world after we conclude our learning here, I'm going to just invite you to take an oath. Not going to make you stand up and raise your right hand or anything like that, but if you're inspired to do so, amen, go for it. But here's the commitment that I'm asking you to make, and try it for a week, and I think you'll probably extend it. Lead with intention and integrity. Lead pay with clarity. Partner with your leaders, show a lot of courage in that partnership, and listen, evolve, adapt, and bring those pay experiences to life for employees. If that's your focus, if that's your overarching focus, more than getting the technical things right, more than figuring out the right data or making the right offer, if you keep that as your overarching goal, you'll build a lot of trust in your pay systems, and you'll overcome some of those hidden harms that you may see. Because when compensation is done really well, it's not just you that leads and wins as the leader. Employees see it, they win through their career, they win through engagement, and ultimately it's a gain for your organization. So thanks, first of all, for having me here today to talk about this. And thanks also for the great decisions that you make, because you're influencing your pay and the confidence in pay programs every single decision that you make in your organizations. Thanks. So I think that I stayed on time. We have about 15 minutes for some questions. We have 14 minutes and 43 seconds for some questions. Any questions I can answer for you? Yeah.
You mentioned when you were talking about the harms at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned this dissatisfaction from employees on the front line who have some hard feelings about the flexibility that they don't get versus exempt employees. I think we all deal with that. What do you have any suggestions on how to I guess soothe that? Because I mean, the reality is the reality.
It is.
If there's coverage demands, that the job is the job.
Yep.
But they do feel that as discomfort. So I'm just curious if you have any best practices on speaking to that.
I'll offer some thoughts, and then I might open that up for some discussions. I think my first recommendation would be to sit down and squeeze all of the allowed or enabled flexibility you can out of your system. So for example, I've worked with organizations that say, we can work around a flexible schedule, but you have to make that up in the same day. Sometimes that policy is in place because it's state law or it triggers overtime. I mean, there's some good reasons for it, but other times it's just there, and you might be having the opportunity to have more flexibility in a different way. The second is, it's not up to us always to solve employees' flexibility needs, right? So encouraging peer-to-peer, shift swaps, things like that, sometimes there's success with that. But the nature of the work is different, and there are pros and cons. I mean, the age-old discussion on exempt work is it's not 40 hours a week. Everything above is unpaid, essentially, right? You're paid for the job, and that's not an attractive trait. So I think the strategy that you have to have is to figure out how you can say it's different but comparable. Are there any other suggestions that we can offer here? Anybody who's solved this in their own organization or eased it a little bit? Right here.
Well, I'll just say I have not solved it, but one of the suggestions I recently heard was that for those employees that are member-facing, that they've gone to a 32-hour work week and are paid for 40 hours.
Oh.
And so that's a really nice thing, and that they love it so much that they're self-managing it. Their absenteeism and their attrition really declined, and they're engaged, and they manage the schedule because they don't want it taken away from them. So I just thought it was kind of a cool idea, and I've been tossing it around in my head as to
That's
how we
amazing.
might be able to make that work.
That would be an amazing business case to stand up to, because the comp side of me is trying to do the math in my head. If you go from, so that's basically 8 hours less a week, right? So is that a 20% pay increase if you're just going by the numbers? Now, that's not the right way to do that analysis, in my opinion, right? Because you should be measuring the productivity levels, and it sounds like it actually had gains. It's almost that exact same business case that you do when you think about offering unlimited PTO or undefined PTO programs, right? It's not actually a liability. You get an upside from it. So that's a creative solution. And probably one that's a little hard to sell to your finance team unless you have the good projections behind it. Great. Any other questions? Staying below the lights here. Christy.
Marta, I want to tag on to what Vera asked about that. I find that that's a great benefit, but it sometimes comes with the thought that you don't have to pay market because you've offered them this great benefit.
Yes.
And I don't think that really flies probably, except for in unique situations, but I'd love to hear your opinion on that too.
Yeah, that gets so sticky, doesn't it? I think there was just a study. It's not exactly the same thing, but boy, I'm forgetting the geographic area. I think it was in the US, and it related to remote work, and it basically said that people value remote work and prefer it, but for an 8% increase, they would be motivated to go back to the office for, it's kind of funny, we've been kind of indexing that number for the last 2 years, and that's where it's at right now. I want remote work, but if you pay me 8% more, I'm happy to come to the office, okay? So, but what you get is exactly what you described there. So you know how comp surveys are put together. There's no like asterisk next to the organization that has the amazing pension program or the 32-hour work week or other factors. So you're really just comparing base pay across all levels. And that's what you have to be competitive with, because that's always, and I guess maybe some of it is not so much getting it at the right level, but knowing how you're articulating your employee value proposition, what makes you better than that next employer that can offer maybe $1 more an hour. I mean, that's significant, but it's not as significant as having a 32-hour per week work schedule. So it almost puts you, the more creative you get in your programs, the more differentiated you can be from your competition, but it also puts you in more of a role as a communicator of, you have to actually sell it, because it's not just the same as every place else. Any other questions?
So I am wondering, is there anybody in here that does the 32-hour work week, and how does that work in a financial institution? How does it work with hourly employees? Because we're kind of like poking around in there, just looking at different programs with that, and I can see the value in it, but I just, in my head, there's pieces that just don't click for me. So I'm wondering if anybody does it and how they manage it in a financial institution, and if you have Saturday hours at any of your branches, because that seems like it would trip it up too.
Yeah. Nobody's experimenting with this yet. I haven't done it in financial institutions. I've done it in other areas, and I'd say that timing was everything. The organization that I worked with that implemented this actually was facing a pretty big pay equity issue, and they knew that they needed to remediate pay levels. So as they did that, they actually worked in an alternate schedule, and it kind of all came out in the end. So it's almost like they shifted their entire pay model at the same time. They also did not do it for the whole workforce, which was not a popular decision at the time, but basically they said, you know what? We structure pay around every key job family. Salespeople are paid a certain way because of what's expected of their role, and our frontline people are paid a different way. So, and you know what? If you find that attractive, we have lots of opportunities for you to pursue on the front line, and it worked in their scenario. Any other questions? Well, great. Thank you so much again for having me. Really appreciate the time spent at this event and all the things I'm learning from everybody that I'm speaking with. Thank you.